Hi everyone, I'm Cadence Diffuse. This is Busybody Podcast, and today I'm speaking with Emma Specter about her book, More Please. I'm so looking forward to this conversation, and I hope you enjoy. Well, welcome. Usually I have people introduce themselves so that I don't mess things up about their amazing bios. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Perfect. My name is Emma Specter. I am the author of the memoir More Please on food, fat, binging, longing, and the lust for enough. And I am also a culture writer at Vogue.
I loved your book, and I was surprised that it was like, you would imagine with that subject matter, it would be really depressing or dark or like heavy, really. And it really to me read like a real like coming of age girl in the big city, like dating and finding yourself. And like, even though there was obviously this central theme of like pretty severe, issues happening with your body and just like your mental state, but also like, if anyone has been in their 20s before, I was like,
yeah,
hard relating. Maybe I haven't like sat in my car surrounded by junk food, but I have also sat in my car hysterically sobbing. So
absolutely. And like, I think that's such a thing. I'm sure people in their 40s and 50s and 60s will laugh at me trying to have wisdom in my 30s, but I do think like it's part like the realization that what you're going through is not necessarily that unique or not, I felt plenty bad about myself in my 20s. It's not like I was like, I'm, so amazing and special for my suffering. But yeah, I'm glad to hear that it doesn't read quite as intense as it might sound.
I didn't think so at all. I mean, my first thought was you wrote so beautifully and just like so honestly about those states of despair and longing and being really young and just confused and finding yourself. Did you feel a sense of like vulnerability hangover at any point, or were you like, once it was out in the world, we were like, oh my god, what have I done?
That's such a good way to put it, vulnerability hangover. I almost feel like I'm feeling it now, like in the immediate, like when I was writing it and it wasn't out yet, it was just this project that was consuming me, but that no one except my editor and a few friends had read. And then in the like month or so following publication, like I was pretty much just doing press and doing, book events and so much cool stuff that I love doing. But, it felt like I was very much in the mode of like, okay, we're going to sell this thing. Like we're going to, it doesn't come super naturally to me to go into like salesman mode, but I feel like there was a little more opportunity for that after the book came out. And now I feel like I'm settling kind of back into normal life. And then suddenly I'll just be like, oh my God, I wrote a memoir that's out there and it's in stores and people can just read. And, I would flatter myself to think that everyone's reading it and writing down all the goss about me. I don't think anyone cares, but it's weird. It's definitely weird. Like, it's amazing. I was at this great bookstore, Book Soup, that I don't often go to just because it's on the other side of town from me in LA. And they had my book and I signed it. And I feel like my first thought as an author was like, this is so cool. I get to sign the book, like blah, blah, blah. Maybe it'll help someone, all the good things. And then I was like, oh, I've put so much mess out there,
Has anyone come up to you? Like, has there been any kind of surprise, like someone wanting to come up to you just randomly and resonate with what they read?
I mean, people at events are so nice about that kind of thing. I just did a reading with the Silver Lake Reading Club, which is such a cool thing. It's just like people reading at a coffee shop after hours, and then like they have a book talk. They have authors come, and like I do feel like people are so open-hearted and so willing to sort of share about issues of disordered eating and feeling weird in your body, because a lot of us experience them.
Yeah.
And, I feel I'm trying to always, when I talk about the book or have any kind of event, I want it to be a space where you can have those conversations. I mean, I'm far from a trained person who should be dealing with, people's disclosures, but I do feel like sometimes it helps to just tell someone or hear from someone that you're not like alone with your, feelings or your disorders or your, not to pathologize, whatever it is that's like difficult in your life, it's hard to feel alone with it. Yeah. I mean, the surprising thing is like that I thought more people would be mad at me, which maybe is self-centered thinking in itself, but I kind of was like, oh, like, people from high school are going to reach out and be like, well, you were a bitch in high school. And like, honestly, the only outreach I've gotten so far, knock on wood, has been people from like growing up who have been really nice and been like, I didn't know you were going through all this, like, or I too went through something like this, or like, yeah, the environment we grew up in was weird, just really validating stuff and not what I expected at all.
I think that's such a lovely thing that your book does, is really, instead of, I don't know why I keep almost feeling like the binging and the other kind of like distress almost doesn't even feel central at times, which I think in a way really allows it to be really easy for someone to see themselves in your story, because it's not just a story about, addiction or something, but anyone who's struggling with anything can really mirror themselves in your story, like very easily, I felt. I mean, I was just like constantly underlining and just being like, you couldn't pay me to be in my 20s again.
That means a lot to me, and like I don't want any. I hope that like my friend told me that she bought a copy and like her little 1 year old was playing with the book, and I was like, I hope she reads it and is like, what? None
Yeah.
of this is familiar to me at all, in 15 years or whatever. But it is really nice to know that it resonates, and I think also what you mentioned about binging being like a through line, but not always the central thing, is like sometimes it's like that in my life. Like
Yeah.
there are obviously like periods, especially in the time that I write about in the book, where binging was very acute and constant and taking up my life and taking up my thoughts, and then I would like put it away and feel normal, and that was kind of the weird seesaw of it too. I would be like, I have what I'm growing to understand is like an eating disorder, but I'm not in service to it every moment of my life. So does that mean it's like not valid, or does that mean that
Right.
what does that mean as far as treatment, or as far as what I should be doing to try to take control of this aspect of my life? Like I think especially when, this is stuff that I didn't really talk about in the book, but like I've looked into, not to get too granular on disordered eating stuff, but like in lots of times throughout my life, I've looked into sort of like the different options for like intensive outpatient, inpatient, different disordered eating treatment. And like I'm in disordered eating treatment but I've looked into like more fully fully intense stuff, but I've also always felt like, well, I don't know if I want to concentrate my recovery in that way. Like maybe it should be something maybe there is no should. I'm really contradicting myself all over the place, but like as of now, like there have been times where I felt like this getting better does and should consume every minute. And there are times where it's like pleasantly sidelined.
Yeah. I mean, that makes a lot of sense. I've been reading Emmeline Klein's
Yeah,
book,
I
Dead
love
Weight.
her
Yeah.
book.
She talks a lot about various eating disorder recovery treatment programs, and is very critical of just like the hyper focus on recovering, where that is now your identity, which is really
Totally.
not helpful to generally to recover and just like find out who you are and gain confidence, instead of just like make your entire world this issue that you're struggling with.
Absolutely. I love Emmeline's writing, and I love Dead Weight so much. And I do think that like it's also hard to focus all your might on getting better in a society that's really fat phobic. Like
Yeah.
even if you're doing all this work on yourself and with yourself and for yourself, like it's not like you're being released into a world where all body types are equally accepted and equally seen as valid. And I feel like we put so much pressure on individuals to recover, to Emmeline's point and your point, instead of being like, do we have any structural support for
Seriously.
recovery? What does it look like to be recovered or recovering, and also a person who's like moving through the world?
Yeah, exactly. I actually was going to quote you. I kind of took from two different pages. One was that there was so much space for you to hate yourself when you were skinny, and so little space to love yourself now that you're fat. I mean, that just rings so true on so many levels of just like kind of what we're talking about. There's no like what are we healing into? Like we're constantly like
Totally.
creating insulation around ourselves so that we can just go through the world. And I always feel like as I just like keep learning, and I just feel like I'm always like peeling off another layer, and both finding freedom and then at the same point having to like re-insulate from some other thing, you know what I mean?
Absolutely.
the the more the lenses are off, the more you're like, oh my god, everything is
Totally.
horrible.
And sometimes it's, I'm going to quote Sinead O'Connor. This is Sinead O'Connor in a comment on a New York Times profile of her. It is no measure of health to be well adjusted to a sick society. Like sometimes you know weirdly that you're doing a little better because you
Sure.
maybe
You're towing the line.
accept this shit a little less. Like I feel
Yeah.
like now I get upset by seeing constant, I mean upset is not the most nuanced word I could choose. I get triggered by like seeing constant Ozempic ads in a way that like I didn't when I was like watching Slim Fast ads at 13 years old, because
Sure.
at that time I was just like, yeah, I am supposed to shrink and like that is what
Yeah.
I'm supposed to do. And so in a way, I feel like it's actually healing that's brought me to a place of like, oh fuck, like the pressure to be thin is looking increasingly different and increasingly it's everywhere in a way that it wasn't even when we were,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I do. I mean, we could just have a whole conversation about like I think probably about 10 years older than you are, but it's just like there was this moment where I actually felt like there was diversity on TV, and then suddenly it like disappeared. And also, obviously,
Totally.
like 80s movies were a lot more diverse, and
Yeah.
now everyone has 0% body fat and like perfect
Right.
teeth.
And it's like the first thing that, Hollywood knows how to do is like, oh, let's cut back on diversity if it's not making quite as much money as it did last year. Like, I just don't think that any concept of body diversity has really been given like a fair chance to saturate the culture,
Yeah.
because the minute, someone who, God forbid, weighs more than 100 pounds, like, isn't testing well, like, not to be too cynical about like Hollywood and, the
Yeah.
media machine that I tangentially work in, but I do feel like sometimes it's almost like the Me Too, what I see as what a lot of people I think see as the Me Too backlash of like, kind of like, oh, well, we gave like, abuse survivors a chance to voice their pain. And now actually it's back on men's rights. We need to let men talk. Like, I feel like it's like we let people be really diverse for like a lot of Dove commercials. And now we're sort of snapping back into to something different.
I think an interesting another like through line through your book that I thought was really powerful is your own paralleling of your experience with your body with also your experience of being queer, and trying to understand that through your youth. And I feel like that is like a whole world connection that isn't made a lot. And even if it's just a young person trying to understand their sexuality, regardless of what their sexuality is, but I just feel like it's no coincidence that we all develop these difficult relationships with ourselves as we go from this precipice of child to adolescent to kind of like playing at our adult selves and our adult bodies and trying to project what that is, especially since female bodies are so sexualized from such a basically as soon as you have any kind of breasts, whether you're 12 or 17, you're
Totally.
getting sexualized. And yeah, what that does to your brain, how that shifts your idea of, the purpose of your body, how to engage with your body. And I think also you just articulated really well this kind of double of, what you were hiding or what you were expressing. Can you speak a bit more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. Something that one of the people I interviewed, Sabrina Imbler, talks about is they talk about in chapter 2 about kind of what you allow yourself to feel versus what you might actually feel for like as a teenage queer person for your friends' bodies. I think the socially safe, acceptable thing is to sort of be like, oh my God, I want to look just like her. And I think for a lot of queer people and a lot of trans people and a lot of people all over the gender and sexuality spectrum, like if it was more accepted for us to wonder, hey, like, do I want to look like that person or do I want something else with and from them? And is it possible that my sexuality is not what it's, quote unquote, supposed to be? I mean, obviously, I think that's I hope that for at least certain kids, it's getting a little easier than it was when, you and I were in school. But I do think like, and sometimes that, but again, on the backlash, sometimes I feel like what I hear from a lot of like boomers, granted, like lib boomers in coastal cities, so this isn't universal, but like I feel like it's like, oh, the kids have gone too far, and like, they're putting cat litter boxes in the middle school, like even non Fox News watching people, I feel like are getting kind of up in arms about like the kids have too much gender freedom, they have too much sexuality freedom, and I'm like, I don't think we even have like a crumb of the freedom that we want to pretend we're actually giving young
Yeah.
people to figure out who they are. Like, or there wouldn't be these kind of, I don't want to say classics or hallmarks of teenage angst and rebellion, but like maybe there's a reason that so many young people engage in self harm behaviors like disordered eating that look so similar. Maybe we're not giving those kids a lot of other scripts to sort of plug into who they are and what they want from their friends or their partners or their communities. Like, I just, I feel corny being like, it's all about the kids, but I just get so bummed out feeling like, in some ways things are worse than when I was in high school. I mean, I, until recently, lived in Texas where like trans kids can get separated from their families if their families like dare to be supportive of them. And it's just like seeing that, I don't know how we're expecting to raise a generation of people who are not kind of falling back on, dieting and
Yeah,
other
control.
dieting and other harms. I mean, I've as I talk about in the book, I have complex dieting feels. If dieting feels good to you or to whoever's listening, go off. Like my worst nightmare is deciding what anyone else should do with their body because I'm not a weird Republican lawmaker, but I do feel like, it is a bummer to like see that 10-year-old girls are still talking about losing weight, and
Yeah.
that's so normalized. And I feel so strongly that I don't want to blame parents. I don't want to, like, I think blame is kind of the antithesis to figuring out where we go outside of just being mad at one another. But I mean, looping back to the sort of queerness and disordered eating overlap, I think it's just really the more I think you feel that you don't really have language for or maybe context for, like not knowing queer people when you're a young queer person, or not knowing anyone who has different body types than yours or your families or your friends, or like anyone who openly talks about, disordered eating or disability or any of the things that can affect how our bodies look and feel. I just think it all kind of gets added into the shame canon, and then, those things just feed on each other.
Yeah, absolutely. Which is also why it's so important to have books like yours that are very approachable. Like I just keep saying, I keep telling people like you got to read it, got to read it. It's not dark. It's not like, oh, I'm all sad every chapter. I was like laughing and like, just like racing along chapter to chapter, just like, on your journey with you. And I
That
hope
makes me
that a
so
bazillion
happy. I mean,
I
that
hope
really makes me happy because I think often, like, as someone who wrote this book, but also for a long time prior to writing this book, was a reader of memoirs by other people about disordered eating and, substance use disorder and alcoholism and all kinds of, addiction and compulsion memoirs. Like, it can be really hard to tap into someone else's story if it, overlaps with yours, or even if it doesn't in specific ways. Like, I wanted to write something that, yeah, could be a reflection, but could also hopefully be a little bit of a romp. I don't know,
yeah.
keep it moving a little bit. Yeah.
I mean, you have humor in it at various times too. So, and I think that must also be key to just like your outlook and your healing, and kind of not centralizing any of these struggles as like your whole identity. And I think
Totally.
like just I'm a big fan of holding things lightly, and whenever I come up against my own darknesses and the places that want to trigger shame for myself, I try to just be like, let us hold this lightly.
I love
This is
that.
just a
Yeah, and like
moment.
not leaving claw marks on things is what something I'm still working on in my life. But humor has always been, thanks to my family, genuinely, not in a sarcastic way, the way that I've dealt with everything. And, that doesn't mean I want like skinny people to make disordered eating jokes to me necessarily, but I also don't think that the world of disordered eating has to be this like place of emotional, wreckage where nothing can ever be funny and nothing is ever held lightly, to your point. Like, I do want to I wish we took the way people and especially women live in their bodies more seriously as a culture, but I don't
Yeah.
think that can't coexist with also like being light and being like, because like as I mentioned, like I don't think anyone's life can be flattened down to the one, even the hardest thing they deal with on a regular basis. And like, in the last 10 years, like I've had a lot of ups and downs with my eating disorder, but I've also had some amazing times. And like, I'm, still best friends with a lot of the people that I was meeting 10 years ago. And like, I don't want to just be corny and be like, and life is amazing and worth living. But, I think for before writing the memoir, even it was harder for me to look back, especially at the time that I was living in LA, and be like, there was some great stuff here. Like, was it an overall slay? Perhaps not. But, you know, not everything is sort of able to be distilled down to like the worst day of the worst week, etc.
And I think also something that really struck me is, and which really resonated with me because I moved to Brooklyn when I was like 24, I think. You were wildly hustling. Like you were just working so hard trying to make a
Yeah.
career. And to me, so much of the binging or just like the triggers was these crazy work hours. You're exhausted. You don't have support. You're dealing with that kind of fake it till you make it thing that we all do in our 20s where you're just showing up places being like, totally, I got it. And like
Yeah, and you don't
inside,
know
you're like, I don't know
anything.
what's happening.
No, and I had
you know?
had and continue to have so much more of a leg up than so many people starting out, especially in journalism. Like, I'm a journalistic nepo baby, as I talk about in the book, but I think having parents who were in this industry made me feel like, oh, I should have it together more. Not to be like, here's why it was really hard. It is only ever a leg up. Any nepo baby who says otherwise is lying. But I think I had sort of a sense of like, this should, like, I can't even get out of the starting gate in terms of
Right.
figuring out exactly like how to cover an assignment. I had this idea that the learning curve shouldn't be hard for me because of like advantages that I'd had. And it's like, those advantages certainly can set up your path, but they don't necessarily guarantee that everything's going to be like smooth forever. And I also think I just had not learned how at all to be nice to myself and be like, hey, maybe it's okay that you don't know how to cover like a gallery opening because you've never done one before and you're learning. I think I just felt like you've been given so much. If you're not an instant success, you're a flop, just kind of governing myself in pretty harsh terms. But yeah, I mean, I think there's such a culture. I've mostly worked in like, art, fashion and art media, and then women's media for the like women's digital media for the last 5 years. So that culture is definitely different than like hard news, but I still think there's an expectation of like, you give it your all. There's not a
Yeah.
lot of jobs. You're lucky to have a job at all. Like, you got to prove your worth every day. And, again, I feel that I think a lot less than someone who has had no leg up or connections ever in the industry and is like trying to fit in with like people. Because, something I want to be cognizant of is also like, I did go to like the same fancy private schools as my editors. Like, was I popular there? No. But, I feel like,
Yeah.
again, I sort of didn't consider for a long time that two things can be true. Like, you've had an easier go of it than some, and also it's okay to be overwhelmed by new things and new scenarios, and nobody's
Yeah.
gonna excommunicate you because you're not like a seasoned reporter from your first week of like being a reporter.
Yeah,
Yeah,
but that is the message that we somehow get when we're young. I don't know why.
totally.
I think you and I probably come from similar sort of high achieving backgrounds and maybe that's just what it is. There's not a lot of images or references for someone kind of trying and figuring it out. It's all just like, and then this person was amazing right away and now they're famous and you're
Yeah.
like, oh, okay.
And like when it feels so ridiculous to me now, but when I was 23, I was comparing myself against like, people who had mounted off Broadway plays when we were still in high school. And
Sure.
like, I just had no grace for myself or no sense of like, you don't actually have, first of all, like a lot of being the prodigy and being the amazing student and writer and excelling, which I did not do in any way until I was maybe, I wouldn't say I found a place where I like was comfortable in my niche until college. But I also think a lot of that can be lonely work, and like especially through stuff like unionizing, with my colleagues at Condé Nast, like I've gotten a lot more out of kind of thinking collectively than just being like, how can I get ahead and like fuck everyone else over, which honestly can be the mentality of media. It can, if
Absolutely.
you let it, it will absolutely convince you that your only job is to like claw over other people to sort of get ahead.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and it's been a real, genuine learning experience to be like, there's a lot, it's harder, but in some ways, but also a lot more powerful to see like what we can build together versus what we can do just sort of competing in the Hunger Games that is digital media.
Well said. Can you talk a little bit about your healing path? I thought it was interesting. You did talk about like two huge institutions, kind of like Weight Watchers on one side, and then also you went into Overeaters Anonymous a little bit, which is such a like all the anonymous groups have like a cachet around them. It's either like people are super into them or they kind of feel like almost passe a little bit right now.
Yeah. I mean, I feel with Weight Watchers, like like every solution to living in a body, I don't think it's for everybody. Again, if it's for you, great, not in a sarcastic way, but like genuinely, if you found a way to not feel imprisoned by diet math, then like I salute you. I think what when it comes to 12-step groups, what really speaks to me, even though I've been in and out of them and am not currently in them, I'm like, they are free and everywhere. And when it comes to especially something that's as classed and raced and just monumentally, systematically not set up for equal treatment as disordered eating, like the advantage of something you can kind of tap into almost anywhere in the world and find a meeting in your language that is not going to cost you money. Like, I think if you I mean, it's hard to, I have a lot of close friends and I've done a lot of reading in recovery communities. And I feel like I'm aware of, some of the more subtle and not subtle differences between, substance based recovery and sort of food recovery. And it's different. It's not the same. And I don't certainly can't speak for anyone in AA or anyone but me who's been in food 12 step, but like, I do think the all or nothing mentality and the sort of cold turkey and you know, that's hard with food. I mean,
Yeah.
it's hard in the sense that you need to ingest food to live, and your treatment plan and your version of what recovery looks like is probably going to look a little more different for the average between people than it might for someone who I would never imply that not taking a drug that you're addicted to or not drinking when you have been using that to cope. That's some of the hardest work that people ever do. But also, there are strict rules around like you just don't pick up. And I think with food, it's sort of like, well, you're going to have to pick up 3 times a day to live, ideally. But how do you do that in a way that doesn't turn into self harm? So I'm just a proponent of going to any place where it feels like this like tangled knot of food and body related badness is getting patiently and respectfully teased out. This is not my best metaphor, but I picture like a big hairball that like a bunch of people are working to sort of comb
Yeah,
out.
yeah. Like when all your necklaces get wrapped up in the
Exactly. It's a
jewelry
tangled
box.
necklace. Yeah, I mean, I think to your point about sort of a light hold or a light touch, I think some people have to hold on very strongly to their rules and to their
Yeah.
specific way that they recover. And for some people, it works to try different things. Like I just came out of my first acupuncture appointment, which is more physical health related than like mental and disordered eating related, but just like is an example of the kind of thing I've been open to in the last couple of years as I've gotten away from the idea that my recovery needs to only look one way or that I'm inherent or even that there's gonna, I think, honestly, for me, getting rid of the idea that there was gonna be one concrete last time I binge in my life has been really helpful because, like, it's just been, in terms of my recovery, so much easier and so much more holistically good feeling to be like, you are a binge eater. You will probably binge again in your life. What can we do to put space between the binges and to make the binges less intense and difficult on your body rather than like, how do I transform myself into someone who simply doesn't overeat? Because I never found the answer to that.
Can you define, if you're comfortable, the difference between binging versus just like eating a lot? I actually wrote an essay about this a while ago because
Cool. Oh, I
I
want to read it. Totally. I mean, I think it's so personal, so I'll define it for me, but it could look completely different, and I'm sure would for, you know, 10, if you had 100 people in recovery from disordered eating in a room, I'm sure each of them would have a different kind of protocol of what feels good or bad to them. I think for me, a sort of precondition of binging is usually solitude. Like, and it's subtle. And sometimes, there were more times than I can count that I would like go have a big meal with a bunch of friends and like, especially when I was dieting, eat more than I intended to. And then later in the day, I would kind of be like, well, I already, ate more than I wanted in a non binge context. I might as well binge. But I think since I've phased out dieting, I've kind of come more to the idea excuse me, that binging is really defined by the act of wanting to disappear, which like might sound sort of head in the clouds, but I mean, I like as much as I am good at lying to myself, I can sort of feel the difference between I'm having some ice cream because I'm having a good time. Oh shit, I smoked weed with my friends and ate more ice cream than feels immediately good in my body. Like I think that's very related to the mind body connection that I'm working to develop, but that feels different to me than like, oh, I've had a bad day. Especially I just moved in with my partner, so I'm rewriting the rules of what it looks like. In the past, when I've lived alone, binges were very much like, okay, XYZ went wrong today. I'm going to go home after work. I'm going to talk to no one. I'm going to order a bunch of food I can't afford and don't want, or pick up food, whatever. And sort of the food almost created the conditions for the aloneness, or vice versa, if that makes sense. Versus like, I think when I was more obsessed with dieting, I didn't draw a big distinction between eating too much with friends and eating too much in a way that was in a fun way, and eating too much by my own definition, alone in a way that like makes my stomach hurt and makes me feel like shit. But now that I'm not dieting anymore, I think it's gotten easier to sort of delineate like, oh, am I feeding an emotional need right now? And that doesn't mean I have to necessarily even put the food down, but just like, can I be a little bit aware of what's going on and what motors are sort of going into this act of self-soothing? Because sometimes I think food is self-soothing. 100%. And I think we're told very much it shouldn't be, but it's,
I'm a big
as I talk about in the book, it's there.
Part of my essay was about like, I think it's a great option for self-soothing with what's out there. It's better than binge drinking. It's better than like,
absolutely. It's more
really
affordable.
In the dark. Like,
it's more affordable. It's not criminalized in the same way.
Yeah.
I mean, in terms of safety, like safety is maybe a weird word to apply to it, but I think, and also,
I think about when I was really young and super stressed with all kinds of anxieties and all kinds of things. I used to walk my dog at like 11 o'clock midnight all over my neighborhood, which was like a reasonably safe neighborhood in Brooklyn for sure. And she was an imposing looking pit bull, but that was a funny move. And I would just do that. I would just walk for like hours, just like walking my anxiety off, which was like nice. But also sometimes I think back of that and I'm like, I wish you could have just made yourself some mac and cheese and like sat in front of a movie.
I so feel that. I used to like, I think I talk about this in the book. I can't remember if it was in an ultimately cut portion, but like I used to swim out really far on the beach in Malibu in this way that, I look back and I'm like, what the fuck are you doing? Stop. That's dangerous. But at the time it was like the only thing that calmed me down.
Mm-hmm. Totally. Yeah. I think for me, I feel like, the only reason that I ask for a distinction is I also feel like so many women, because we live in this culture where we're constantly policing our bodies and our food, so many women call like anytime they eat a lot binging. And totally. I've literally had conversations with clients who are like, I think I binge. And I do a program called Nourish Yourself where we try and like heal the remnants of our eating disorders.
I love that. Because I think sometimes it is remnants and it's like, and we also have this sense that like, I think sometimes we triage our own care and we triage ourselves out of care. And we're like, well, I'm not, 80 pounds or insert whatever amount of weight, heavy or small you might associate with sickness or badness, which is its own problematic assumption. But I think we're really good at finding reasons why our pain is not important. With women, queer people, trans people, insert your own,
is people will be like, oh, I'm binging. And then they sometimes, part of the program is we keep a food diary just so that I have no calories or anything like that. I just want to see how often people are eating.
No, I keep a food log that's like not about calories, but it feeds the part of my brain that needs to record without being like this banana was 90 calories, but
Right,
sorry, continue.
exactly. But this is just to say, what I'll see is people were just stressed and tired and had a long day, and then they just like ate the rest of the leftovers in the fridge. And I'm like, that is not a binge. Like, that's just like you're tired. Like, that's okay.
Totally.
You're
And like,
allowed to just be a person.
you're
Not that a
allowed to be a
binge is not
person that,
okay, but I think what you're describing is an actual lack of pleasure. And I think that's a
yeah,
really important distinction.
like actual pain and discomfort, and like, maybe under the umbrella of dieting, eating half of the ice cream and not having a stomach ache is just as bad as having the whole thing and not and having a stomach ache. But like, I've really tried to focus more on physical effects and sort of be
Yeah.
like, did I eat to a place where I feel physically sick? Did I eat to a place where I can't show up for other people in my life? Because I also think, I talk about this in the book too, that for a long time I was like, I mean, I'm not really hurting anyone. Like,
Right.
and I don't even, at that point, I wasn't even really, I was sort of alternating starving and binging and not really putting on weight in the way I did later in my binging career. And I just didn't have enough sort of, I guess, I don't know whether to call it community ties, or I mean, like I said, I had a lot of the same amazing people in my life than I do that I do now, but I just don't think I saw myself as, I just wasn't as,
Like
and
it seemed almost like you didn't see yourself as connected to them in the same way, or like
exactly. I felt really
integral.
disconnected even from like best friends, and I didn't feel any sense of like, oh, like here, now I feel like I have a more, it's not that I don't have the urge to binge a lot more frequently than I actually binge, but I do feel like stuff will come into my head like, oh, like I'm supposed to like, make dinner for friends tomorrow night, or like I'm going into my partner's office tomorrow. It feels great to have more things in my life and more things to show up and be sort of present and physically and mentally healthy and able and therefore, but there's this line in a Raymond Carver poem that I'm going to be pretentious and quote that I can't even remember the exact quote. I'm not even good at being pretentious, but the poem is basically just about this kid wandering through his parents, like the remnants of his parents' dinner party and drinking leftover alcohol and being like, I want to give up all the good things in my life for more of this. And I think that's still where my brain goes to sometimes. It's like, oh, if I wasn't weighed down by all these pesky life forming amazing connections, I could just binge and be miserable. And I'm so glad that that's not my situation anymore and that I have more to be sort of accountable to and for. But, it's hard to get out of that mental state.
It is. And I think like that's also like such a place of grace for when we're younger, because we literally, our lives are not full when you're in your 20s. People,
No,
romanticize it like you're having fun, all stuff. Oh my God, worse friendships, worse relationships, like
personally, my mom is always
terrible
like,
jobs.
yeah, like your 20s are actually, I think it was very helpful having her set the expectation as like your 20s actually suck. Because I think people make it seem like they're good. And then
Yeah.
there's
And
so
then
much
that
pressure
feels
to
like a
be
failure.
enjoying what is basically a weird second adolescence. Like,
Yeah.
yeah.
I remember one of my first jobs in the city, I was a assistant for this like seemingly very cool artist. And I was like, wow, his studio's in Greenpoint. I'm cool. And like, and his studio was, of course, like in this barely heated, like cement warehouse. And all I was doing was emailing people for him that were like owed
Oh,
him money for gallery work. And it was so boring and horrible and like not glamorous at all. And then one day he installed an illegal gas heater that really should be outside inside, which that's illegal because it could vent inside and kill you.
yeah.
And I remember like calling my boyfriend at the time and being like, well, it's warmer because he installed this like heater thing. And I like explained to him, and I basically like heard my boyfriend get more quiet, like as he was just like, and basically he was like, you need to get out of there right now. And you need
Oh
to
my
tell him
God.
that you're not
Deeply
coming to
20s.
work. I
So
was just like,
real.
what?
I had no concept of like what a landlord should even
Yeah.
do. I was just like, yeah, our fridge hasn't worked in 4 months. I think it's fine.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. No, and that was the period of my life where I would just be hysterically sobbing, like at least weekly, somewhere, public, private, like just,
So
you know.
real. So many places to cry.
That's the nice thing about New York. You can just be like, I'm just gonna sit on this stoop here and
I
just sob
know.
hysterically, and people will just keep going
I
by.
mean, in LA, you can drive and you can cry in your car, but
Yeah.
it's nice to sort of be having a public meltdown in New York and everyone's like weirdly gentlemanly to you about it and sort of like ignores you and gives you your privacy, but maybe like is nice to you in a small way. I feel like that
I
New York
remember
is
a
good
friend
that
of
way.
mine had like a horrible breakup and went to the UPS store and the guy was just like, "Oh, hey, nice to see you." And just like that kindness, she just like immediate like sobbing, but he just like continued through their transaction like she wasn't sobbing
Oh,
hysterically
that's
and was
so New
like,
York.
"Anything else? Would you like me to like duct tape today? Anything?" And she was just like, "No." And he was like, "Okay."
My God, real.
Well, I want to kind of we're almost like tracing through the book a little bit. A lot of what you start to talk about is joy and like connecting to your body, movement wise in joy, food wise in joy, in relationships in joy, and kind of like the space for joy opening as you're really, as I was reading it, expressing yourself more and more. And whether that expression like necessitates your body changing or whether the body changing kind of breaks open boundaries for you, it just feels like you come into yourself literally and then you're you have all these resources suddenly all around you, and that's
Yeah,
like so affirming in this journey, especially because it isn't neatly wrapped up at the end where you're like, and I never binged again, like, and
yeah.
I'm in love and that's that.
I wish I could be like, and then I got a partner and now I'm sorted. Like, my life is objectively way better, and like, I think my partner has made my life way better. I wouldn't be with them if they weren't making my life better. But yeah, I think it was easy not to tie it up with a bow because like I have no such bow to tie it up with in my actual life, you know? And
Yeah.
I was hoping that wouldn't feel like a kind of weird storytelling thing. I know people tend to want resolution, but I think I would get really frustrated by eating disorders and narratives that felt really concluded. Like, I would kind of be like, well, that's great for you. Like, when I was more acutely suffering, I'd be like, that's great for you. But I'm still over here not knowing how
Yeah.
to kickstart liking myself at all. So I felt like one thing I could hopefully offer is just being honest that, like, even when your life changes in ways you could never have dreamed of and is so amazing as mine is, like, things can still suck.
For sure. And I think something that you speak to is, which also isn't often in the cliche narrative of like healing and finding love, is that you do have to experience a different reality sometimes, and that's also something that we can't do alone. And like that idea of like you have to love yourself before someone else can love you, I think some of the greatest healing in my life has been from other people loving things about me or showing me love so that I'm able to see that that's possible or that I can
Totally.
experience that, because like otherwise you're literally like climbing up a cliff with like those pick things, and then someone can literally
Absolutely.
just extend a hand and be like, "Oh, you're really nice and funny." And you're like, "What?"
And you're like, I what me? No, I'll drop the hand. Yeah.
So, I also kind of wanted to ask about your fashion because I also interviewed Sophie Strauss on the
My
podcast.
girl.
Yeah. And we had a great conversation. I could talk to her. We could just like
She
have our own
is
podcast.
she's got the gift of chat. She's so good at chat.
Yeah, and we talked a lot about like what's the definition of flattering and just kind of like obviously personal style and things like that. And I follow you on Instagram and you're always posting just like cute outfits and things. I know that obviously you worked in fashion this whole time, but do you feel, has that become more a part of the way that you express yourself as your body has changed, or was that always there and now you're just like getting more into also talking about fashion that fits your body and that whole world?
It's weird. I feel like in a weird way, it's such an interesting question. I think in a weird way, gaining weight indirectly brought me back to a place of caring about clothes. Not, I think I had, the typical teenager thing of caring about clothes in the way of like, I don't have the right jeans, everyone's gonna hate me. But I also have been really, I've been vintage shopping since I was 13. Like, my godmother would send me insane, like, vintage crazy stuff that I often wouldn't even wear because I didn't feel like I had the like bold personality to pull it off. But,
Yeah.
I've always, my favorite way to travel in a new city is going to vintage stores. And it's harder. I mean, I wrote a story for Vogue about how much harder it is to vintage shop when you're plus size or fat. But I also feel like the trade off is that I am not trying to make myself invisible with clothes anymore, which I actually feel like I was when I was thinner. Like my goal was flattering, right? My goal was like, how do we kind of dress this body so that it looks like the thinnest version of itself?
Exactly.
And I think there was a certain crossing of the Rubicon with, I don't know at what point of weight gain it hit, or what point of mental, what point of quarantine my brain was like, all right, I'm buying crazy clothes online. But I do think that was part of it. I think also being locked away from everyone for a
Sure.
while makes you be like, how do I want to show up in the world now that I can? But yeah, it's been truly one of the greatest joys being like, I can't hide the fact that I'm fat, and I don't want to, and that's not my priority with clothes anymore. And my priority is going to be like having fun and having silly little purses and having things that excite me. And I sell vintage now, like just on the side as a fun little side Instagram gig that is, I'm sure, blowing up all my poor patient friends' Instagrams. They're like, we don't want to buy your vintage dress that has a stain. But I feel like that has been a really fun way to just like have fat community, because
Yeah.
it feels a lot different, sending someone like a dress I've so loved in a 3XL that I just like I'm not wearing anymore, and they like someone bought a dress from me at my friend's like plus size vintage bazaar and told me about where she was going to wear it, and like it looked so great on her, and it just felt so sweet and community oriented and different than like mailing out size XS leggings on Poshmark like I used to do. Like it feels a lot more based in like, I've loved this item. And it also like Sophie honestly has taught me so much about sustainability and using the things we have. And even like she's taught me about going to our community dye bath in LA and like getting stuff dyed if it's stained or whatever, and just starting from a place of like, how can I use everything I have? Because like we all know, not to be like the mom who's like, there's kids who don't have anything, but we all know that there is so much infinite suffering and waste in this world that it feels like a personal, really beautiful thing to be able to be like, how can I dress myself in a way that makes me happy and enjoy that as the privilege it is, without feeding into like a garment industry that,
Yeah.
and fashion and, publishing, and they're all linked, but industries that are not for human beings and not for bodies and not for workers.
Yeah. How has it affected your editorial career? Because I was actually just in Vogue, and I always find when I'm interviewed by like a major publication, here I am just like a cis hetero white woman, but my personal values are very not maybe what my, like what that kind of demographic would be
Mm-hmm.
expected. And I always often feel this funny like miss when I'm talking to people, because I'm like, oh, you're like really in the goop world, and
Totally.
of course you are. It's like these big magazines, W magazine, like of course that's the headspace of these people, but it's like super
Yeah.
heterosexual, it's super like gender conforming, and I'm just getting interviewed now and again. And I
Yeah.
wondered what that was like for you when you were more kind of like performing the thinness and the femininity and all these like expected kind of ways that like a journalist in a fashion editorial might look, and what that feels like now.
Totally. I mean, it's interesting because I was out as queer like when I started at Vogue, but a maybe more like legible version of queer. Like I wasn't dating my now partner who's trans. I was dating mostly like other cis at the time lesbians. I was sort of, I am white. I went to fancy schools. Like I ticked a lot of boxes for fitting in, even though I had these certain things that made me stand out. And I gained a significant amount of weight while working at Vogue. So in some ways, I don't know what it's like to show up at my like full weight and kind of be like, hey, I'm applying for the job, even though I
Yeah.
certainly weighed more than probably a lot of people in the office when I interviewed. Like, I also feel uniquely lucky to not to harp on unions, but to know so many of my colleagues, not just at Vogue, but throughout the building and throughout Condé Nast, because we've been organizing together, which makes me feel a lot less like, oh shit, I don't have, seventh grade revival. Like I don't have the right clothes. I don't look the right way. I'm not fitting in. And I also feel just a lot less pressure to be legible. Like I love my colleagues and I I feel so lucky that I don't have to deal with sort of compartmentalizing myself, because I do feel like I show up to pitch meetings and I'm like, here's my gay trans life. And like, I want to write a story about my dog because that's what's going on with me this week. Like, I'm uniquely lucky to be in a work environment where that's possible. But at the same time, I also am getting better at sort of not feeling like every space I'm in has to reflect all of me. Like, I want to be in spaces that I can live with it myself for being. And, to be honest, like, I work in fashion. It can be hard to square my personal beliefs sometimes with what the industry represents, especially as a fat person, especially, as a queer person, as an anti-Zionist Jew. Like, there's a lot of elements that are hard to square with working in, a traditional media. But I just I know how, especially because so many of my friends are journalists who don't have the advantages that I've had, like, to get a job where I get to write for a living. I try, even if it sounds really Pollyanna-ish, like, I try to just be like, that is absolutely the biggest thing that makes your life different from how it was 6 years ago. Like, you are getting to express yourself every day at work. And, like, even if, every single minute or interaction of your workday isn't like a consciousness raising session, like, you are getting to do something that you couldn't even have imagined getting to do.
Yeah. Um, I'm also Jewish, and I feel like I could do a whole podcast on just like Jewish like thinness through the ages.
Totally.
Do you feel I mean, I just feel like as we know and hopefully listeners know, like thinness is so rooted in racism, and there are just countless and countless examples of like how these ideal bodies are really about excluding other bodies, and
Totally.
that's really completely by design. And I think it's really interesting when I started thinking about that, and when that was became part of my own thought process. And I'm a modern dancer um, by by schooling, and there's a whole movement in the modern American modern dance world that was mainly Jewish women who had left Europe, who kind of started the like real barefoot American modern dance. And a lot of it was because their bodies didn't conform to the ballet aesthetic,
Oh, interesting.
and because they were curvier and stronger looking and shorter and all these kinds of things. And once I kind of made that connection and I was like, oh, this is so fascinating, I just think about how that, I mean, my mom's whole side of the family, like everyone has disordered eating. It's all my grandmother, like, it's, I have empathy for it because I see that my grandmother, she really wanted to fit in, and she's very, like, she doesn't celebrate. She's not religious anymore, but yet she always knows when all the holidays are. Like, it's, and that makes me sad for her that she really gave so many things up about her own culture to fit in, and then really pass that on. And then, there's all this other stuff like my own absence of like cultural tradition because of that lineage that I wish wasn't there. Also anti-Zionist. but um but can you like do you see that in your journey a little bit? Because I feel like a lot of my own liberation of my own body has been about recognizing how much of my early identity around how my body did or didn't fit in was basically about whether or not I looked like a wasp. And I also went to fancy schools, and they were very super waspy, like they were not diverse places. And
That's so interesting.
I felt, this is very embarrassing. I literally, and this is embarrassing and bizarre, until I was like in my teens, I literally in my head didn't think I was white, even though I knew that I was white and like
Yeah.
clearly knew that I was white. But I felt that different from my skinny, straight blonde hair classmates that in my mind I was like, I guess I'm not white. And I was friends with the only, like, my best friend was Asian, my other best friend was Puerto Rican. Like, I had a diverse friend group, so maybe that was kind of also what was in my head. But I remember this like teacher of mine just telling me why I was white. He was like, "You have the privilege of being white when you walk in a room, so you're white." But I literally
Well,
vocalized it at some point, which is like crazy. But I also think so interesting, and literally is because what I have big butt and thick thighs that made me not. I was so different. It felt that I was so
So
different from
interesting.
all these other skinny white girls that I literally thought I wasn't white in some capacity.
I mean, I think, yeah, kids are so attuned to difference and so attuned to, like, am I different than the people around me that I totally get being like, I grew up on the Upper West Side of New York and there were tons of Jews around. And if anything, I was less Jewish, in the sense that my mom is half and I wasn't raised traditionally. We would go to, Yom Kippur services and stuff with like friends' families. I'm not, my parents emphasizing that. But yeah, I think it's hard, especially when so much stuff about how we feel about our bodies is passed down. I think it's hard to come from immense trauma, as like most Jews do. Even if you're pretty removed from it, as I am. Like I obviously didn't know the members of my family that died in the Holocaust, and I didn't really have a good set handle on the family members that they left behind, even if I did know them, because like I had a grandmother that was like, "Oh, grandma's so crazy and mean." She passed a long time ago, but as an adult, I'm like, Jesus, she was raised trying to pass as Catholic in an orphanage after her parents were taken her dad was taken to Auschwitz. Like it's hard to it also feels crazy in some ways to be of that lineage and be like, I do my little emails job, like, and not to make it about the issues of the day, but that's why I feel such a strong tethering to fighting for liberation for everyone and Palestinians in particular, because of what so many of my ancestors and so many other Jews' ancestors survived. And I just think, like, a book I really love on this topic is Milk Fed by Melissa Broder, which I think really gets into the ways that not only that we want ourselves to be the perfect waspy girl who never gets hurt, who whether or not she exists, but also the
Right.
way our mothers and matriarch figures want that for us, because they want us to assimilate and they want us to protect ourselves with beauty and thinness, because that's like something that's currency when you don't have other currency sometimes, and I really get wanting that. And I think, a big thrust of my book is not blaming moms and not specific. I mean, everyone is welcome to blame their own individual mother, but I just want us to look more systemically at like what were the tools that the people who raised you, which is maybe not just your parents, are given, and could they have reasonably been expected to instill something that was really different for you based on what they had.
Yeah, exactly. How as we finish up, I'm curious, like, how's your family kind of experienced your evolution?
They've been really great, honestly. Like, I expected and insisted that my parents be great because they're writers, but they also, like, never wrote about me like I wanted them to, and they were like, no, we're good when I was a kid. And I feel like as an adult watching, like, influencer kid culture, I really appreciate that.
Yeah.
But I also, like, I tried to give my whole family, like, but, I did worry about, like, my aunt's feelings, like, writing about her body. Like, I tried not to be gratuitous or go too deep into any issues that aren't mine, but, it felt like a big part of my story to say that I have an aunt I'm really close with who is larger bodied than my mom, and we have always been kind of more similar in that way. And that was probably hard for both of us in different ways. But I tried to give my whole family that was mentioned in the book the deal of like, read an early draft. If there's anything you can't live with, we'll work it out together. But no one even asked me to change anything, which is
That's
crazy.
wonderful.
Yeah, I'm lucky
Yeah, I
in
mean,
a lot
that
of
was another
ways.
really nice thing in your memoir, was just like you do have such a lovely connection to your family and friends, which I also appreciated, because I think a lot of times when we think of like addiction issues or eating disorders or whatever mental distress, we often imagine the person like, huddled under a bridge, like
With like no
excommunicated.
connections, no tethering. And
Yeah.
truly, like, so many of my connections have survived and flourished partly because I'm just stupid lucky and people have cared about me enough even to stay in the game when I haven't had much to give them, but also because the older I've gotten, the more I've realized that those tethering connections are the things that make you want to treat yourself better, because you want
Yeah.
to be a participant and you want to show up for the people that have shown up for you.
Get ready for dog life. You're going to be like, I got to rise to
Yeah.
this occasion.
Yeah, I'm already like, well, he's up at 7, so I guess I'm up at 7. Great. I love dog parenthood. No, I do. He's a good boy. I'm very happy.
Well, thank you so much for being on. It was such a treat to, I mean, as soon as I started your book, I was like, she has to be on the podcast.
This was so wonderful. If you're ever in LA, I'm in New York a lot, so we should get a drink or a coffee or something. But if you're ever in LA, also let me know.
Absolutely.
We'll hang out with Sophie.
I would love that. Oh my God. Dream.
Yay. Thank you so much.
That was Busybody Podcast. I'm the founder and owner of Brooklyn Strength Studios. You can find me on Instagram at Brooklyn Strength. You can find out more about my offerings on my website, brooklynstrength.com. I hope you'll subscribe to my Substack, After Class. All's in the show notes. Please rate, review, and subscribe. Please share with your friends so that more people listen to this podcast. I love these conversations, and I hope more people can hear them. My music is by Rob Byrne, performed by the Wild Yaks. My podcast is produced by Brad at Soundtrain Studios, and my illustrations are by Jackie Mendez and Azul Trejo, and edited by myself. Thank you so much.